What Patton did when a canteen fed German prisoners but refused the black drivers who delivered the food. December 1944, a supply canteen near an American depot outside Liège, Belgium. The room is warm, smelling of fresh bread and hot coffee. German prisoners of war sit comfortably at the wooden counter, nursing steaming mugs and eating thick sandwiches. Outside in the biting Belgian wind, American soldiers stand in the mud, shivering. The canteen manager turns them away. He waves a hand toward the door, his face set in a mask of rigid, calculated indifference. He has decided that these men are not welcome here. He has decided that the supplies they hauled to the front do not belong to them. It is a quiet, systematic erasure of the men who keep the army moving. But the general is on his way, and he is about to shatter their fragile order. This is the story of what happened when dignity was denied and then restored. It is a stark reminder of how authority can be used to either enforce cruelty or command respect. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when prejudice met consequences. Joining us as we examine the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Corporal Chester Jackson, 26, from Oakland, California, served as a driver for the Red Ball Express. Back home, he had worked the docks, loading cargo until his lungs burned and his muscles ached. When the war came, he signed on to drive, determined to do his part. He had seen the brutal reality of the front lines, the mud-caked trucks, and the hollow eyes of men who had been pushed to the breaking point by 72 hours of continuous combat transport. He knew what it felt like to survive on nothing but coffee and sheer willpower. On this frozen morning in Belgium, he simply wanted a hot meal from the supplies he had risked his life to deliver. He stood at the threshold of the canteen, his hands trembling slightly from the cold, waiting for a basic measure of decency that he had more than earned. Technical Sergeant Ray Howell, 33, from Peoria, Illinois, managed the canteen with a cold, iron-fisted sense of order. He held a deep-seated belief that military regulations were meant to be applied selectively based on his own rigid definitions of social status. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his shoes buffed to a mirror shine that stood in sharp, insulting contrast to the filth-covered gear of the men arriving from the front. He walked with an air of unearned privilege, convinced that his position behind the counter granted him the right to curate who was worthy of sustenance. He kept a fresh, private stock of bread hidden away, reserved exclusively for the German prisoners he felt compelled to feed, while he maintained a strict, unofficial policy of exclusion for any American soldier whose uniform or skin color did not meet his narrow, prejudiced standards. By December 1944, the European theater stood on the precipice of a brutal winter. The Allied advance across France had slowed to a crawl as supply lines stretched to their absolute breaking point. Hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations were being hauled daily by the Red Ball Express, a massive logistics operation that relied on thousands of truck drivers to keep the spearhead of the army supplied. These men were the heartbeat of the invasion, but the sheer chaos of the push into Belgium created a dangerous vacuum of authority at the smaller, isolated depots scattered along the winding supply routes. In this environment of frozen roads and constant fatigue, administrative oversight often failed to reach the remote outposts managed by local commanders. Many officers, preoccupied with the pressing demands of the front, turned a blind eye to the way these staging areas were operated. A quiet, toxic culture of inequality had begun to fester in some of these supply stations. Local managers, emboldened by the lack of direct supervision, enforced their own prejudiced regulations, often prioritizing the care of captured German prisoners over the basic needs of the very soldiers who sustained the war effort. While Army policy mandated that prisoners be treated in accordance with international law, there were no directives that permitted the denial of food and rest to Allied personnel. Yet, because the front line was a fluid, shifting place, small tyrants behind counters felt safe in their segregationist practices. They operated in the shadows of the greater conflict, confident that the high command would never look closely at a single canteen in a remote corner of Belgium. The situation was a microcosm of a larger, systemic struggle that threatened to undermine the unity of the entire fighting force. It was here, in this cold and forgotten depot, that the rigid hierarchy was about to be challenged. Captain Arthur Vance, a weary man with dust-caked spectacles, walked into the canteen. He approached the counter where Technical Sergeant Ray Howell stood, wiping a glass with a clean white rag. Vance spoke with the quiet authority of an officer who had seen enough of the war to know that logistics were the thin line between victory and collapse. He asked Howell for service for the 5 men standing shivering by the door, noting they had not eaten in over a day. Howell didn't look up. He gestured at the men and gave a flat, dismissive grunt. He told the captain that he had plenty of coffee and bread for the prisoners in the rear, but that his policy for others was firm. Vance leaned in, his voice tightening. He explained that these drivers had been on the road for 72 hours, that they had delivered the very ammunition that was currently stacked in the depot's warehouse, and that their mission was vital to the next offensive. Howell leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He stated that he ran a clean house and that he would not have the place cluttered with personnel who did not belong there. Vance pulled a regulation handbook from his pocket. He cited the standing orders regarding the fair treatment of all American servicemen. Howell laughed. He looked at the sergeant, then at the German prisoners sitting at the counter, and told the captain that he was not interested in what was written in some headquarters booklet. He said that he was the one deciding who sat at his tables and who stood in the cold. He looked Vance in the eyes and said that colored personnel were not served in his canteen, and that if they wanted food, they could go to the designated facility 12 miles back. Vance straightened, his expression hardening. He asked Howell if he realized he was depriving soldiers of sustenance that they had physically transported to his door. Howell turned his back to grab a fresh tray of bread for the prisoners. He muttered that he would feed whoever he wanted and keep out whoever he chose, and that the captain could take his regulations elsewhere. Vance realized the conversation had nowhere left to go. He made a sharp note in his ledger, turned on his heel, and walked out the door toward his jeep. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's command jeep pulled to a halt in the churning mud outside the canteen. The engine cut, and for a moment, the only sound was the hiss of the radiator in the freezing air. He stepped down, his 4 stars gleaming on his helmet, his ivory-handled revolvers resting heavy on his hips. He walked through the door unannounced. The room went dead silent. The German prisoners at the counter froze with forks mid-air. Howell turned around, his face draining of color as his eyes locked onto the general's face. Patton said nothing. He walked slowly past the rows of tables, his boots crunching on the floorboards, until he stood directly in front of the canteen manager. Patton looked at the counter, then at the German prisoners, and finally at Howell. He asked who was responsible for the management of the depot. Howell stammered his name and rank, his voice cracking. Patton asked him if he was the one who had posted the sign on the door. Howell nodded, his eyes darting toward the floor. Patton asked him how the food currently on the counter had arrived at this location. Howell answered that it came in on the daily truck convoys. Patton asked him who the drivers of those convoys were. Howell fell silent, his throat moving as he struggled to speak. Patton stood motionless, his eyes cold and fixed on the man. "You have turned this depot into a place of exclusion," he said. "You look at these prisoners and see men who must be fed. Yet you look at your own countrymen and see men who are beneath your notice. You have forgotten that the very bread on this counter, the coffee in these mugs, and the warmth in this room exist only because of the men you turned away at the door. Those drivers have spent 72 hours in the mud, hauling the weight of this war, while you sat behind a clean counter, safe and well-fed, deciding who was worthy of a meal. You have failed in your duty as a soldier and as a human being. I do not care for your policies, your personal preferences, or your excuses. A man who delivers the supplies that keep this army fighting eats before the enemy, before the staff, and before you. You have a choice. You will immediately integrate this facility and serve the men who sustained it, or you will pack your gear and be assigned to the most hazardous, unsupplied convoy running to the front tonight, where you can experience exactly what those drivers endure every single day. Decide now. Howell stood trembling, staring at the floor, before he slowly reached out and tore the sign from the wall. Patton's order transformed the canteen in an instant. Howell, his face pale and eyes fixed on the floor, signaled his staff to begin. They moved with frantic urgency, clearing the tables of the bread and coffee served to the prisoners. The German laborers, sensing the shift in power, sat in uneasy silence as their special treatment vanished. Outside, the shivering drivers from the Red Ball Express were beckoned forward. The first men stepped into the warmth, their faces etched with the exhaustion of the road, moving past the prisoners who were now relegated to the shadows of the room. The smell of hot black coffee and fresh bread filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold, damp misery of the convoy trucks. Witnesses, including a group of stunned officers who had arrived with the general, watched in silence. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the weight of restored justice. Howell stood behind the counter, forced to serve the very men he had spent the morning insulting, his hands shaking as he poured cup after cup. Every movement he made was a public admission of his failure, the scene a living echo of the segregation he had tried to enforce. After the war, Chester Jackson returned to the Oakland shipyards, where he lived a quiet, hard-working life until his passing in 1994. He rarely spoke of the incident in the Belgian canteen, but his children often remembered him, pausing to thank the drivers of any long-haul truck he saw on the highway. A small nod to the long nights he had spent in the service of his country. He viewed that afternoon as a moment of profound validation, proof that the dignity of a man was not something that could be stripped away by the prejudices of another. No matter how much authority that man held, Ray Howell returned to a life of anonymity in Peoria, drifting through several unremarkable jobs before passing away in 1978. He never sought to revisit his wartime service, and those who knew him in his later years described a man who grew increasingly bitter, often complaining about a world that had shifted away from the order he had once tried to enforce. He spent his final decades in a state of quiet decline, never once reaching out to reconcile with the past or acknowledging the role he had played in the humiliation of his fellow soldiers. Patton never mentioned the canteen incident in any of his official memoirs or public addresses. He kept the report of the event tucked away in his personal files, seeing it as nothing more than a brief, necessary correction of a breakdown in discipline. In a private letter written to a close confidant shortly after the war, he noted simply that a commander's greatest test was not found in the heat of battle, but in the cold silence of the camps, where men forgot that they were all on the same side. Some historians have argued that Patton's interventions were merely theatrical displays designed to solidify his own legend as a disciplinarian. Others have argued the opposite, suggesting his actions were a necessary, if blunt, instrument for maintaining cohesion in a fractured army. What is certain is that the canteen was integrated that very day, ensuring that the men who supplied the war effort were no longer forced to endure the indignity of being denied the sustenance they had risked their lives to bring to the front. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have chosen a softer, less public way to resolve the dispute? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about the moments that force people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.